Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. Of course, you have to silence those noisemakers, devices, and don't forget to evaluate us at the end of this talk. We'd love to hear your feedback. So we are very excited to share our journey about the Ratchet & Clank franchise and why it has endured. But first, we should tell a little bit about ourselves. So I'm Brian Allgeier. I was the design director on the first Ratchet & Clank game. I was also the creative director on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 game. And I was very fortunate to work with this guy.
And I'm TJ Fixman. I was the senior writer at Insomniac Games from 2007 to 2013. I worked on all the PS3 and PS4 Ratchet titles with this guy. I also served as a creative consultant for Hasbro, working on movie properties like Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Micronauts.
So before we get started, we just want to share a little clip that we like quite a bit, and this will help some of you who may be unfamiliar with the franchise. All right, I don't know what just happened there. We have a technical difficulty. Sorry about that. It worked when we were rehearsing in our hotel room this morning. Okay, this should now work. Yes!
Space. It's huge. So huge, in fact, that if you lost your car keys in it, they would be almost impossible to find. Luckily for Ratchet, Captain Copernicus L. Quark was on the case. His mission, rescue the Lombax's one and only friend. Yep, without Clank, Ratchet was alone in the universe. Alone. Alone. Alone.
You realize this ship has an ejector seat, right?
Sorry. I guess you could say I've been a little antsy in my pantsy at the thought of getting back into the hero business. Yep. These wild stallions have been in the stable too long.
Right. Look, just keep your eyes peeled. Talon says this sector's crawling with mercenaries.
Rest easy, my friend. My vigilance is both eternal and peripheral.
Warning. Warning. Unidentified anomaly detected.
Hang on. Shifting to evasive maneuver.
Oh no, we're gonna die! We're gonna die! Oh, good thing I'm wearing clean underwear.
Will you shut up? We are not gonna die! Aphelion, engage gravimetric stabilizers.
Negative. Stabilizers offline. Thrusters offline. Landing flaps offline.
All right, so we're gonna die.
All right. Sorry, so the reason why it worked was because it wasn't in presenter view. And now we have to go back to presenter view. This is like the most awkward presentation I've ever given. Okay, here we go. Okay, and everything is now going to work for the rest of the presentation. Okay. Yeah, my computer has a mind of its own. Okay, well, so I have to say it's been really hard to believe it's been over 15 years since the first Ratchet & Clank was developed at Insomniac Games back in 2002. I feel very fortunate, we feel very fortunate to be standing here looking back at this long-running franchise. So I'm curious, how many people played Ratchet & Clank back in the day in 2002? Wow, okay, that's a lot of hands.
All right.
That's awesome. How many people worked on the Ratchet & Clank games? Hey, all right, we got some Insomniacs, some old schoolers here. Okay, so never, did I dream that that very first game would lead to 6 games on the PlayStation 2, 6 games on the PlayStation 3, mobile games, a manga series, a comic book line, toys and vinyl figures, art prints, tattoos and cosplayers. That's when you know you've really hit it big. Adorable plushies, a feature-length movie, and in 2016, we made a game based on the movie, based on the original game.
All right, and despite how confusing that all sounds, the 2016 reboot was actually massively successful. It is our fastest-selling Ratchet game ever, and it won Family Game of the Year at the DICE Awards. And one of the things that surprises us most is that over the years, platformers and mascot-style games have become kind of a tough sell. Console gamers have been drifting more towards darker and more realistic fare, so it's really cool to see that Ratchet & Clank still has a place in audiences' hearts.
So out of the 14 Ratchet & Clank games made in the last 15 years, Insomniac developed 11 of them. We started with the trilogy of the first Ratchet & Clank, and for us it's certainly been a journey fraught with both ups and downs.
Insomniac turned out a new title almost every year, which feels insane in retrospect. I can brag for them because I was an employee at the time, but they did this all in-house with a 35-person team. But I promise this is not just going to be a stroll down memory lane. We'd like to treat this as a sort of franchise post-mortem. So we can talk to you about what worked, what didn't, what really didn't, and offer some tips on why we believe some franchises endure. But to do that, we're going to have to travel back in time. And fortunately, we have a connection at the Great Clock, this temporal space station from a crack in time that also happens to be 100% real. So Sigmund, are you there?
Yes, sir. Senior Caretaker Sigma 0426A standing by at the Great Clock.
Awesome. Can you take us back to March of 2001?
I don't know. Orbit said I'm not supposed to use this thing as a time machine, but I guess I can make an exception for the Insomniac folks. Stand by for temporal displacement.
Sorry, doing dance. All right, so the year was 2001. Insomniac's new game was going to be our 5th game. We'd made Disruptor and the 3 Spyro Dragons before that, and our team size was 35 people. George W. Bush was in office. Phones made just phone calls back then, and the laptop gun was all the rage, and of course there were some classic cinematic masterpieces. TJ, where were you back then when all this happened?
In 2001, I was in college, so probably someone in Orlando with a really bad Slim Shady haircut. Let's just check in and confirm. Yep, that's it.
Ooh, did you do that to your hair on purpose?
Sadly, I did. I did do that to my hair on purpose.
Okay, so let's talk about Ratchet & Clank, the beginning. So Ratchet & Clank actually started out as a girl with a stick. Actually, our code name was Girl with a Stick. And so we had worked on the Spyro games. We wanted to try doing something a little bit older, and for about a year we worked on this project, which was kind of a mashup of Tomb Raider meets Legend of Zelda. And the team just wasn't feeling it. And our CEO, Ted Price, saw the writing on the wall, and he had the courage to just kill the project. It was time to work on something that we could all really get excited about. So we went back to the drawing board, we started coming up with a bunch of ideas, and our chief creative officer, Brian Hastings, offered a simple idea that got everyone really excited. And that was an alien that travels from planet to planet collecting weapons and gadgets. And as simple as that sentence is, it actually got us really excited and sparked our imaginations. And we started to draw upon inspirations on how to create this new alien. So one of Brian's early inspirations was the book The Little Prince, but there were plenty of other influences like Marvin the Martian, Star Wars, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Banjo-Kazooie, Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, Super Metroid, The Iron Giant, Super Mario 64, and Legend of Zelda. So one thing we all loved about Brian's pitch was this idea of exploring the unknown universe. Our team was excited by the idea of building this living, breathing, colorful galaxy that people could discover. Character artist Dave Girton began to sketch our hero, starting with this lizard-inspired creature who had this massive weapon and extendable arm. He was cute, but not very relatable, and lacked that charm we wanted. He needed to be warmer and more approachable, and eventually evolved into our famous furry mechanic here. I first heard Ted Price actually coin the term Lombax to describe Ratchet's race. We also liked the idea of him having a voice, which is very new for mascot characters back then. So we needed someone for Ratchet to talk to. So the original design for Clank, we painted him as this childlike C-3PO. We even experimented with having a child voice with a British accent, and it just wasn't working. It felt like this kind of weird father-son relationship, so we decided to put the two on more equal footing and focus on making it more of a buddy story. For Clank's particular backstory, he was written as being this factory defect who almost got scrapped and was saved from the assembly line.
Brian Hastings and Ted imagined the game as feeling almost like an intergalactic buddy cop story. The wisecracking alpha would shoot first and ask questions later, while the logical sidekick would act as his foil. It's a dynamic that we've seen a lot in movies, but if you drop it into a game full of anthropomorphic characters, you get something really fresh. And we almost imagine sort of like a Lethal Weapon meets Saturday morning cartoons.
So, we certainly wanted humor to be a prominent aspect of the game, so we developed another franchise favorite, which was Captain Quark. He became such a vital part of the series that when he was left out, fans would actually be upset. We view this guy as being kind of like a Homer Simpson meets Captain Kirk.
And the environment artist started imagining Ratchet's home planet, Veldin, along with places that he would travel, like space stations and high-tech cities.
So we wanted to really get going quickly and start putting these levels into the game. But the problem was we were just starting to develop the PlayStation 2 engine and tools, and we couldn't actually create these levels with these long draw distances. Fortunately, we were working with industry legend Mark Cerny. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Who actually had this, he was helping us design the game and came up with this great idea to create these dioramas, which are also now called beautiful corners, where we could create the starting level of a game and actually looked like a real game, felt like a real game. And that started to get people really excited and definitely got interest from Sony and starting to give us the green lights. So one of my first tasks was taking Metropolis and turning it into a real design. And we started to develop the metrics for how fast and far Ratchet would run and jump. The same metrics that would be used consistently throughout the 15 years of the franchise. And all of this, of course, was being done using 2D paper maps. We weren't messing with any of that 3D stuff back then. Eventually, our engine tech could handle the long draw distances, and Metropolis was fully realized here. This is the actual shot of the game.
Now, during the prototyping stage, it quickly became apparent how important weapons and gadgets are to the series. So Insomniac designed over 60 weapons and gadgets. We abandoned hard science because we figure, like, who wants to be restricted by physics when we could be turning enemies into rabbits or chickens or penguins?
So in November 2002, Ratchet was very innovative for its time and was, of course, positively received, but we felt like we haven't really pushed it far enough. It's to some degree felt weapons optional, and it was like a platform game, but we wanted to really dive deeper into more of the RPG elements. We were just really kind of dipping our toes in the RPG waters.
And the story and characters need a lot of work too, because at the time, Insomniac was a baby studio. They needed to focus primarily on gameplay so they can get to gold, get it out the door, and then hopefully get to make another one. So Ratchet & Clank wasn't really a universe from a mythology perspective. The characters showed promise, but they didn't have a lot of depth. In fact, if you play the first game, you'll notice that Ratchet was kind of a jerk. He was too sarcastic, too snarky, too selfish. So for the next game, we recast Ratchet with James Arnold Taylor, and we rewrote him to be a kinder, more curious character with a sense of humor that didn't require putting others down. So thanks to that first Ratchet game, Insomniac learned a basic but important lesson. Make the time to develop your heroes and their relationships. Like in game design, it's very easy to get laser focused on the game because the natural inclination is to say, hey, we have to make the game work before anything else. But your audience is not going to care about your heroes if they don't care about their place in the world.
So over the next two sequels, we refined the franchise. On Going Commando, we fully embraced the weapons for our gameplay strategy and added RPG elements. We had a lot of variety in this game in the form of mega games. We included this battle arena that really let people test out their weapons and encourage people to buy weapons and try them out in these really cool spaces. We also had these new tiny planets that we called spherical worlds. This is actually something that we had prototyped for the original Ratchet & Clank. We had them flying around one on a hoverboard, but we just realized we couldn't do it in time, so we saved that idea for this game. We had hover bike races and space combat missions too.
Now, players appreciated the huge leap forward in terms of gameplay depth and breadth. They also loved the double entendre of Going Commando, because not a lot of stylized franchises could be so subversive. So we decided to embrace that going forward, and another Ratchet & Clank tradition was born.
Yeah, when they pitched Going Commando to me, I didn't know what that meant. Sounds good, yeah, okay. Okay, so that leads us to, of course, Up Your Arsenal. Okay, so in that game, we introduced multiplayer, single-player battlefields, and our most iconic villain of the series, Dr. Nefarious. He was inspired by old-school sci-fi B-movies and quickly became our most recognizable supervillain.
Up Your Arsenal was a huge hit with players and critics. Looking back, there were a lot of key elements that made it successful. Ratchet & Clank had a textured relationship. They bantered, they disagreed, but you could always tell these guys were buddies. We had outrageous weapons with badass upgrades. There were gadgets and planet hopping. We had tons of Captain Quark. The visuals were stylized with rich detail and a vibrant palette. It had the Douglas Adams-inspired humor that I love so much, and a great balance of platforming to shooting.
But yet this was around this time where we suddenly started to see mascot characters like fading away, or they were kind of putting on the back shelf until later. And they started going into hibernation. But we believe that part of the reason why the Ratchet & Clank series endured was that we dramatically evolved it. We transformed it from being a platformer with shooting to a shooter with platforming. So we had seen that people were very receptive to the guns, and we've really integrated that. And by the third game, we had full circle strafing with R1 trigger and really made this into a modern-day shooter, third-person shooter in terms of mechanics. So the big lesson here was we really had to adapt or die. It's really important to listen to what players want to play, but then, of course, you're having to watch the market trends and learn what other games are doing. But then you also want to amplify what's great about your own game and what makes it stand out. So there's definitely a tricky balance there. So we really thought we had hit our stride with Up Your Arsenal, but we started to face a small obstacle here, and that is the fourth game, SLUMP. So really what that is that this happens all the time with movies and trilogies where you feel like you've said all that you could say with the third game, you nail it, and then you're like, oh, well, people want more. We have the opportunity to make another game that people want to play, but what do we do? So, again, it's like that rule of threes, and we were concerned, too, that we'd made these three games back 1 year after the next, and what do people want with a fourth game? Are they starting to get tired? And is there some level of franchise fatigue happening here? So the question was, well, maybe we need to adapt further. Maybe with Up Your Arsenal, we made it a third-person, modern shooter, but how can we take this even further? And we were looking at other games that were really big. We were looking at, I don't know, your GTAs and stuff like that. And we had a little bit of envy, like, oh, what can we do there? So at the time, for us, it was Halo. I know. So in 2005, we went dark.
Now, right off the bat, you're going to notice that we dropped the double entendre. We even took Clank's name off the title. In hindsight, we got to acknowledge that was kind of not cool. Now, while other co-op multiplayer features were strong, it was still a big departure from the franchise. We removed fan favorite Captain Quark, we sidelined Clank, and lost the exploration factor. Instead, we sent Ratchet to various planets simply to survive a Running Man-style game show. It was a fun game, just not a Ratchet and Clank game, and definitely falls into the what were we thinking category of the franchise.
So, co-op was very well received, and the game was a commercial success, but the reviews were not as favorable. Deadlock received lower than expected scores, and even one reviewer called it soulless gun porn, which that hurt.
That's cold.
I know. At the time, we had 3 huge successes behind us. We thought we could not fail.
Now, looking back at the checklist that made Up Your Arsenal successful, it's easy to see why this was sort of a misstep for us. We had no engaging buddy story, our customizable weapon feature resulted in reduced personality, planetary exploration was gone, Quark was left out of the fun, the color palette was muted, and we went overboard with the shooting. We even covered Ratchet's face for the majority of the game. Insomniac tried to make the game different, but in doing so, we swung the needle just a bit too far. It was clear that we had just deviated too far from the franchise DNA. Okay, so what do we mean when we say franchise DNA? These are the core pillars of the game from both a gameplay and lore perspective. No matter what you change from game to game, this is the stuff that stays constant so that each entry feels like it was made by a singular voice. It's one of those things you don't really think about until you see it done poorly, and then when it's done poorly, it really stands out.
So we knew we had to return to what made previous games great, but also faced a new challenge on the horizon, which was the PlayStation 3. For this new platform, we needed to overhaul our engine and our tools. This meant we needed to build everything from the ground up. We couldn't reuse any of our characters, any of our sounds, any of our assets. We had to redo everything. So this was a big technology upheaval for us. This is common to most franchises that span multiple platforms. Anyone, of course, who's worked in the industry for a few years knows this happens quite a bit, where you have to kind of do a retooling. We had promised with Tools of Destruction, though, that we were going to make this CG animated movie, or it was going to feel like you could play a CG animated movie. I started to get really caught up in the allure of what the PlayStation 3 could do. And I was thinking about, oh, maybe there could be like procedural worlds, or we could have multiplayer modes. We could have this like open space exploration. And I started like chatting about this in one of the design meetings. And a team member walked up to the whiteboard and wrote in giant letters, "Technology is evil." And so he was coming from having worked on our other PlayStation 3 game, which was a launch title, which was Resistance: Fall of Man. And that game had a ton of ambitious systems. We had like procedural glass and cloth and like hoses and crazy AI systems. And we managed to get glass into that game, but everything else, a lot of other stuff had to get cut. Because in the end, you have to really be careful when you're starting with new tech. It can be a lot of rope that you end up hanging yourselves with.
The glass was great, though.
The glass was great, yeah. So given that we had to rewrite our new engine and tools, this meant a smaller scope. So we had fewer cinematics just because of the higher fidelity animation. There was no multiplayer or co-op, no spherical worlds, and no fun stuff like racing or other special modes. We had to really go lean on this one. So we were wondering, how do we please longtime fans if the graphics were taking a step forward and our gameplay and story breadth was taking a step back? We need to go lean and deep on our franchise DNA, but where to start? So the answer for us was to tell a tightly told story about Ratchet and Clank's origins. Rather than following the fly-by-the-seat of our pants approach as we did with our previous games, we needed to start thinking about world building. That's when we brought on TJ.
I've been working in games for a couple of years by then, doing QA and design support on Resistance: Fall of Man. And I also come out to LA at the time to build up a writing career, but I had never written a video game before. I was coming on board several months into production. And one of my chief duties was to take the sort of loose mythology of Ratchet and Clank and work with this guy and Brian Hastings to build out a unified lore that could inform future games, as well as comics and movies. Around this time, stories were starting to matter more in the gaming space, so we really knew that we had to step it up. We had a great set of characters and planets, but the original lore was done 100% on the fly and had to be tied down so that we could satisfy some of the audience's pressing questions. Here's a horrifying list of things that we did not have the answers to. Who is Ratchet?
Simple, right?
Beyond just guns and wisecracks. Like, believe it or not, like, we didn't know. We knew there's surfacey stuff, like what made him fun, but what about all the writery stuff that I like to talk about to make programmers' eyes glaze over? What drives him? What's he afraid of? Like, I love that Ratchet was a wide-eyed engineer who prioritized fun and thrills over basic safety protocol, but the earlier games never really explored why. And to me, Ratchet is constantly struggling with his identity because he was born an orphan and the only Lombax as far as he knew, so his need to invent came from his need to feel like he had an impact on the universe. Building on this vulnerability helped us create a more textured character that players could relate to. Where are the Lombaxes? I would love to tell you all that we had this mapped out in a Bible, like under lock and key in the Insomniac Vault, but we had no idea. It was white space at the time. Fans were dying to know what happened to the other Lombaxes, and we wanted to address this in the new trilogy. Who is Clank? The original game featured him as a factory defect that escaped the junk heap, but over the course of 4 games, the studio felt like there had to be more to him. Brian Hastings asked me to come up with a reveal for him that would shed new light on his origins without hopefully feeling too retconned. And during one of our brainstorming meetings on Tools Destruction, the team was very excited about time manipulation as a mechanic. So we developed a connection between Clank and a faction of time-bending creatures called the Zoni. And at the time, I had a vague idea of how he was connected to them, but felt that this could tee up a compelling origin story to be revealed in a future game. And there was so much more we didn't know. These are all questions fans wanted the answers to. And even though we were going to a new galaxy in a future saga, I had to start compiling a franchise Bible so that every team had a place to start. And I had to get started halfway through production when all our sets were built, our characters were modeled, the levels were already locked down. So like this was truly trial by fire for a first-time game writer.
We like to throw people into the frying pan.
Yes, you do. Yes. And once we hit alpha, it became very clear that we didn't have the time or the resources to answer everything. So I had to prioritize while laying the groundwork for the next game. That way fans could feel secure knowing that the answers were coming. I like to call these mythology branches, fleshing out your world with details that serve as flavor in one game, but can be a full meal in next. So the Zoni, Terracnoid Sages, the Court of Azimuth, as well as other terms that might sound like gobbledygook if you haven't played the series, these concepts were seeded in Tools Destruction without knowing exactly how they would be used going forward. But when we paid it off, it provided a sense of continuity and the illusion of a plan that I definitely did not have. Cheers.
I thought he had a plan. So
yeah, no.
Heavy fold.
So what did we learn from all this? If writers do their jobs right, the audience will engage with and comb over every crumb of lore they're offered. It's the double-edged sword of good mythology work. They'll look for cracks and continuity errors. They'll create fan-made wikis to point out every consistency. So keep in mind, make sure not to define heroes by a game mechanic. Find something emotional and relatable about them, something that they're missing. Audiences want to see themselves in their heroes. And that's going to give your character the kind of depth you'll need to carry them over the next 2 or 3, or in our case, 7 games. White space is okay, but nail down the critical aspects of your lore. Use mythology branches to tee up a larger world. Be specific about those aspects. No ambiguity, because ambiguity can oftentimes read like plot holes or an unsure writer. And consider whatever you write, law going forward. Write for the hardcore gamer. When you're deep in crunch, it's very easy to say people won't notice. But the hardcore do, I promise you, they always do. They will YouTube it, they will wiki it, they will tweet it at you angrily, they will evangelize or eviscerate your work. I've had both done, and I can give you a guess as to which one is better. Putting in the work benefits not only the team, but future partners and ancillary products based on your series.
So by doing all that work and defining the mythology, it just gave us a great foundation for building these worlds and adventures that are for our upcoming trilogy. But as new designers joined the team, we realized we could not solely rely on oral tradition. Over the 6 years, we had people leaving, coming in, new designers. And so we had to start figuring out how do we develop a Ratchet and Clank and standardize our process. One thing that came up, which was kind of wild, was we had these crate stacks. And for a lot of us working on the early game, some of this was pretty intuitive on how to place them. But some of our new designers would either put these giant stacks and people would just start getting tired of pressing the square button, like hitting all of those crates, or they'd have very sparse stacks that wouldn't quite be stacked correctly. So Brian Hastings, our creative officer, actually wrote a 4-page document on how to stack crates.
The subtle art of crate
I know,
stacking.
yeah, it was pretty in-depth. It was impressive. So, of course, one of the most important processes that we had to standardize was how to design great weapons. On Deadlocked, we had this really cool feature, which was you could create customizable weapons in various combinations, but they started to kind of lose a little bit of their soul and personality. So we thought, well, what are some general guidelines or goals that we could use while brainstorming weapons? And so we threw out 3. One is they had to be comedic, strategic, or spectacle. And they had to hit a 10 in one of those categories. And so this actually helped us in developing one of our favorite weapons, Mr. Zircon, where originally he was designed as being a synthenoid, which was a character we'd had in earlier games where it was a fire and forget drone that would kind of hover above you and just shoot at enemies. And they were kind of fun to have, but we thought, how do we step this guy up? And we started building this character, and he looked like one of these consumer bots on the left here, and had very little personality. And we're like, okay, there's no strategy here. It's not really much spectacle, but we can certainly push it in terms of the comedy factor. So I asked the art team if we could give him a mouth. I walked over to TJ. I'm like, hey, we got this guy named Mr. Zircon. He speaks in the third person. Go.
This is not the kind of request you want to get during crunch time. But I understood Brian's vision. I agree with him that it was important. So I came up with what, in hindsight, looked on paper to be the dumbest idea for a character ever. I wondered if Mr. Zurkon loved to talk trash, but just happened to be really terrible at it. He thought everything around him was stupid. He had no inflection in his voice, and he lived only to kill what was around him. So in a couple days, I whipped up 400 lines of VO and took it to the team, and they looked at me like I was insane. But when we recorded it, got into the game and balanced it, it worked, and it became one of the most iconic character gadgets in Ratchet & Clank history.
Yeah, I think it's all because we had those goals early on how to push all these weapons and bring them up to a 10. So, one of the weapons that was a big favorite, of course, was the Groovatron, which was a weapon that makes enemies dance. And, it's interesting, when we started to have that way of evaluating our weapons, we looked back at this weapon and we realized why it was so successful. It actually hit all 3 of those goals. It was hilarious. It also had this big spectacle with all these beams coming out, all these enemies dancing, and it was a very strategic weapon. You could toss it out, and it was like an AoE stun weapon. So as part of our return to form on Tools of Destruction, of course, we brought back one of our signature levels, which was Metropolis, or Aliro City. And this time it was featured in stunning detail with enemy fire raining down. Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction was a big hit with fans. It was often praised as looking like a Pixar film and hit all of the key ingredients of our DNA. In terms of story, it both answered and raised many questions about Ratchet & Clank's origins.
But the game's cliffhanger ending left people feeling a bit cheated. And if I was to do it over again, I probably would not have done it. Sure, cliffhangers can be appealing, and I think used appropriately, they're an effective way of retaining audience interest, but I think oftentimes it just ends up leaving players feeling frustrated.
Yeah, essentially, Clank got abducted by the Zoni, and nobody knew what happened to him. So players were left hanging with this question. And we really wanted to address this cliffhanger, but our problem was that the next game was going to be in a couple of years, and we didn't know if people could wait that long. But fortunately, we received both a blessing and a curse in the form of it's my fancy PowerPoint transition there, development curveballs. And so all projects face these where out of the blue, there's a particular request, the publisher asks for something, or some tech change happens. And during Tools of Destruction, what happened with us was we originally wanted to do a co-op, have a co-op feature, and be able to play the campaign with split screen or potentially online. And we'd talked to Sony about this, we promised it, and then about midway through, I think we were like, yeah, that's not gonna happen, sorry. So the deal we ended up making was like, well, now we'll make a smaller product instead, and would come out in 2008 between Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time, which was the next big installment. So, that was DLC at the time. It was like this brand new concept. And we were pretty excited about working on this, but unfortunately it would eat a lot into our pre-production time. So for a while we had a bit of a freak out moment. And we realized, though, that we could turn this obstacle into an opportunity. With a smaller game, we could experiment with new ideas and new mechanics, and they could potentially lead into future games. And one idea that was starting to gain traction was doing this 2D space combat game that was similar to Geometry Wars, because that was kind of the flavor of the month. But then we thought, well, we've got this cliffhanger, we kind of want to continue Ratchet & Clank's story. TJ was getting hate mail, so maybe we should focus more on the story. And the one thing we really loved about the previous game that we wanted to do was Space Pirates. I mean, those are just awesome. And so that's how Quest for Booty was born. It's actually the title that we originally wanted to come up with Tools of Destruction, but it worked much better for this smaller pirate-based game. And we really loved pirates at the time. We actually started to decorate the office with pirate flags. We had pirate skulls. We felt like the little band off in the corner making this crazy little experimental game. But we could leverage all of the stuff we had from Tools of Destruction, but this also gave us the opportunity to start experimenting. And we came up with this idea for this wrench tether gadget where the head of the wrench would detach and latch onto bolts, and you could kind of pull them down. It was really a new concept for platforming and puzzles. You could also pick up flaming lava rocks with it and throw them off of grind rails. And we had this really cool open island that you could freely explore with these towers.
We also had several NPCs that Ratchet could talk to and experiment with conversation trees. We want to see how far we can get pushing features that you often find in RPG-style adventure games. Now, to address the cliffhanger, we used this game as an opportunity to reveal the identity of the villain who kidnapped Clank, and we used Dr. Nefarious. Fans have been clamoring for his return ever since Up Your Arsenal, and bringing him back felt like a great way to build out our universe, which now spans something like 3 galaxies.
So we saw a lot of positives with this project. We developed, of course, the new wrench mechanic. It was like one of our biggest returns on investment, even though that investment was pretty small. It's cool to see that it's still making money. And it was, for me, actually one of the most enjoyable games to work on, given its small scope. It had much fewer headaches. In terms of, in terms of negatives, our Metacritic was actually one of the lowest ones I think Insomniac ever got, which was 75 at the time. It was 3 to 4 hours long. People complained about the length, the no weapon upgrades, there was no quark. And then we had this teapot matter, which I like to call teapot gate.
Yeah. At one point in the game, like, you're traveling around this level that I believe we called Morrow Caverns with a decapitated space pirate's head on a stick. And he would walk around, he would talk as you're walking from room to room, and I thought it would be funny if he just sang "I'm a little teapot" in order to open one of the doors. It was just one of those like dumb, funny jokes that you throw in without thinking a lot about it. It turns out someone actually owns the rights to "I'm a little teapot," and that person has lawyers. So they got involved and it actually became Teapot Gate. So the bonus tip here is don't ever assume that a nursery rhyme is public domain.
Yeah. I was actually thinking of playing the clip, but we probably shouldn't go.
Yeah.
Okay, so for that game, we adopted this why not mindset. You know, we really wanted to turn our curveball into an opportunity, and we felt like we did. It gave us a chance to really flesh out our universe. It really helps, you know, experimentation we find helps lead to future breakthroughs, and you really need to kind of do these on the heels of a success. Had we done this after Deadlock, that probably would not have been a wise choice. Of course, smaller, cheaper games have lower stakes as well. So for our next game, it was Ratchet Clank Future, A Crack in Time.
A Crack in Time was my favorite, and it's still available at Holo game stores everywhere.
Thanks for the plug.
So we had less than a year to make our biggest PlayStation 3 game because, you know, Quest for Booty, again, ate up a lot of our pre-production time. We really wanted this game to be great because we started to think that this was probably going to be the end of the trilogy, if not the franchise, and it was going to be our last and best Ratchet Clank.
Now, at the start of the game, we revealed that Clank had been taken by the Zoni to the Great Clock, which had fallen under the control of Dr. Nefarious. We pulled the curtain back on Clank's origins, explaining his connection to the Zoni as heir apparent to the station. Rather than just being a defect, we revealed that Clank was destined to watch over the flow of time. And I hadn't even started watching Doctor Who yet, folks. We had Charles Martinet voice him, and meeting the guy who plays Mario was definitely a career highlight for me. I'm happy we don't have a picture of when I met him because you would absolutely be able to tell from the look on his face that it was a career highlight for me.
So Clank's story led us to develop a lot of special time puzzles where players could play and record multiple versions of Clank to solve these mind-bending puzzles. From our open world layout experimentation that we did in Quest for Booty, we actually developed this Krell Canyon level in A Crack in Time.
And remember that mythology branch called the Court of Azimuth? Well, from that branch alone, we were inspired to create a Lombax character named Alistair Azimuth. It was a huge reveal for fans, and he helped us answer a lot of questions I mentioned earlier about Ratchet's history and Lombax lore. We paid off other mythology branches as well. The Trachnoid Sages became a full-on faction in Crack in Time.
So this game was massive, even featuring space exploration, which is something that we really wish we could have done in previous games. We finally got to do it with this one. You could fly from planet to planet and engage in space battles.
And even though our schedule was impossible, we kept piling more onto our plates for this one. So for example, there was this idea that was pitched to our team about space radio, where as you travel around the galaxy, you could actually listen to different stations. I think the audio guys were playing a lot of GTA at the time. And it felt like something that could be really fun for Ratchet and Clank. But I had something like 3 days to write hours of commercials, DJ segues, banter, news broadcasts. Implementing it is, I'm told, a nightmare. The audio guys did it, not me. But this was an opportunity to build out our mythology and take one step closer to the feel of a living, breathing universe. And everybody loved it. And I think it ended up being one of the biggest sort of selling points of the game.
And it's always a great sign when you're working on a project and it's kind of late in production and we feel like feature creep's been hitting us pretty hard, and then you put in this other request, but everyone's really excited to make it happen and see the potential of it. So not only could you fly to these different planets, of course, you could visit these small spherical worlds. And this, of course, was something that we had developed in Going Commando. Around the same time, our animators were really hitting their stride in terms of making what felt like a feature-quality movie. I really hope this movie plays. Yes. Yep. All right.
Quick! Everyone inside the temple! Ocelot is coming!
All right, Quark. You ready to let those stallions out of the stable?
I was born ready.
I believe Dr. Nefarious was clear as to the repercussions of leaving your hovel. The clock is ours.
Whoa, wait. Who?
Dr. Nefarious has no authority here, villain. In fact, I'm not even entirely convinced he's a real doctor. So return my sidekick's pal before I bring the thunder. You win again, technology.
So as you can see, our animators had a tremendous amount of fun with Captain Quark, and of course we even had Nurse Quark.
I love him. As we headed towards the end of production for A Crack in Time, Brian and I talked about what to do with Dr. Nefarious. We were fairly convinced this was going to be our last Ratchet and Clank game, and we wanted to kill him off in spectacular fashion, something poetic and nuanced and beautifully tragic. Then we put him on top of a flying saucer and slammed him into his own space station. We even hired an outside effects house to vaporize the entire level after the crash. So we made this guy super dead. And I remember feeling really sorry for whatever poor writer would have the task of resurrecting him down the line. We felt at the time that this was like the perfect send-off for such an iconic villain. But of course, if you played other games in the series, you know this came back to bite me. I remember how during the first game, Ratchet was kind of a sarcastic jerk. By this time, we had evolved him to the point where he could have moments like this.
So, I can't talk you out of this, can I? Ratchet, we have been on many adventures, but the clock needs someone to protect it. It is what I was built for.
Our animators actually spent more time on that one shot than any other shot in our cinematics. And fans sent me messages saying that this is the first time a Ratchet and Clank game ever made them cry.
And I hope you all realized that there would be spoilers when you came to this talk.
So A Crack in Time hit all of our franchise DNA. It was a buddy story with heart, imaginative weapons, robust space exploration, gadgets, Quark, vibrant visuals, Douglas Adams-inspired humor, and a great balance of shooting and platforming.
And then some. It featured many favorite features from past games, plus some familiar ones. TJ, I agree, this was definitely our favorite game in the series and what we consider to be a peak for the franchise. But unfortunately, we had a hard lesson here, which is don't get cocky. So every peak has its valley. One of the things that was interesting is that a lot of times long-running series face franchise fatigue. We had shipped what we thought was our best game and our last one. But yet it had done well enough to warrant some sequels. And so we knew that there were still people out there who wanted Ratchet and Clank. But reviewers who liked the game were raising concerns that the series was getting a bit long in the tooth. So this was another time for us to adapt or die. And the next 3 years, the series took a number of detours. What we learned after A Crack in Time was that friendly family games were moving into other popular genres like couch co-op with titles like Little Big Planet and Castle Crashers. We're also finding that fewer younger players were playing less console games and were migrating towards mobile.
So we decided to make a 4-player co-op game, Ratchet and Clank All for One. And notice that we have our pal Dr. Nefarious in the bottom right. That's the same guy we smashed into a space station. So here's another little bonus tip for you. Never ring a bell if there's even a slight chance that the publisher might want it unrug. Because after we shipped A Crack in Time, Chad Dezern and Sean McCabe, they pitched this new Ratchet game to Sony, and one key piece of feedback they received was to make Dr. Nefarious a playable character. I just remember hearing this and my jaw dropped, and I was like, we just flew that dude into a space station. And Greg Phillips from Sony was like, maybe it was just a flesh wound. God. So I had to use the Ratchet Clank comic to get Nefarious off the saucer before it crashed. Mayhaps not my most elegant retcon, but I think you got to give me a pass on this one, folks.
So the game had a number of highlights. It took some of our classic Ratchet gadgets like the suck cannon and the swing shot and turned them into these really cool co-op devices. You could actually grab other characters and like throw them off of platforms. You could have a chain of characters swinging along on swing shots. And it was also a very gorgeous looking game.
I also thought it'd be funny to make Captain Quark President Quark, because I felt like the idea of a lying, pompous, blowhard celebrity getting elected president would be hilarious. It's a joke that has not aged well.
So All for One embraced many elements of our franchise DNA, but excluded some, most notably the buddy story and the third-person shooting mechanics.
One criticism we weren't prepared for was the title. Fans just found it too kid-friendly. For the record, like Chad and Sean's original title was Foreplay. When that one didn't clear, the one that I tried to push through was Multiple Organisms.
And there you go.
And there you go. There you have. I think that may have been the fastest no I ever received from Sony.
Okay, so All for One did succeed financially, and there was a lot of love for it, but many fans and critics were also disappointed. What followed was a Full Frontal Assault, which returned to classic gunplay. It had this tower defense context, but it lacked this heartfelt buddy story and the feeling of space exploration. 2013's Into the Nexus was more of a return to form, but felt like a half step towards the epic adventure that people expected. So looking at this graph of the series, and this isn't like an accurate, like I didn't actually measure out, but—
It's not to scale.
It's not to scale, yes. It's clear that we hit a bit of a lull with these last three games. While some of these experimental games had done well, the reception from fans and journalists was mixed. But that's okay, because what we found is that you really need to embrace the unknown. And I realize that there's a bit of a contradiction here where I'm like saying, well, we adapted or died, but we also had to embrace our franchise DNA. And the truth is that it's a tough line to walk. You have to constantly evolve, you have to constantly change, but then you also have to know what's made things great. And trying to stick that landing is very tricky. So we realized that to keep our series going, we had to take these bold steps. We had to take these experiments to move it into new directions. So now around the same time as we were working on Into the Nexus, development for Ratchet & Clank the movie had begun. And for us, this was a sign that we had really hit it big. Never did I dream that there'd be a movie based on this franchise with Paul Giamatti, Sylvester Stallone, Rosario Dawson, and John Goodman. It was great to know that Ratchet, Clank, and Quark would be voiced by the original actors, though.
And while we had some influence over the film, we knew that we had to do right by the fans and make a great game despite being in the position of making a game based on a movie based on the original game. The team had the challenges that we never had to face before because after I wrote the original draft of the movie, it was handed off to writer-director Kevin Monroe and Jerry Swallow and the Rainmaker team up in Vancouver. And from there, things started to change around dramatically. So we got to experience the thrills of parallel development with an animated movie that was constantly in flux.
Insomniac's North Carolina studio director Chad Dezern suggested that the PS4 game, rather than being called a reboot, that we thought of it as a reimagination.
And the movie was going through numerous rewrites, and we were always playing keep up with the changes. Sony even wanted us to use some of the movie's cutscenes as game cinematics. And since the movie storyline deviated from Insomniac's mythology, this presented a challenge. How do we make a game that feels like our universe when it's based on a movie that has since departed from its source material? Our solution was to tell the story through the eyes of an unreliable narrator. This guy, my favorite character, Captain Quark. Here he is getting the full spa treatment over in Zara Doom Prison. With this device, we can have Quark exaggerate, we can have him lie, we can have him manipulate events, so we can divert from the movie where we felt it was necessary.
So we updated all of our shooting mechanics and RPG gameplay. I actually went back and tried to play the original Ratchet & Clank, and all the controls were so weird to me. I had trouble just shooting something. So we took all the lessons that we had learned over the entire series, and we improved the game and brought it up to date. Metropolis made a return visit to this game, where Ratchet could fly his ship in a city with an insane amount of detail. So ultimately, revisiting our original game helped us re-embrace what made the series great, a robot and furry alien from opposite sides of the galaxy who team up to stop a supervillain and become friends in the process. We had this wonderful opportunity to have this epic do-over. We took everything we used about what made Ratchet and Clank, the world that the characters inhabited and how to face challenges optimistically and at times fire our engines into the unknown.
And of course, the best games are made by the best teams. We count ourselves very lucky to have worked with some of the incredibly talented individuals over at Insomniac.
Yeah, it's been an amazing ride, and I just want to thank a few thank yous. Nolan North did the voice actually he's the Nathan Drake of Sigmund, and also Amy Hennig helped us mentor this talk. And I just want to thank Sony, all the Insomniacs, all the creatives and wonderful people that have helped make Ratchet and Clank such an amazing franchise. So thanks for coming, and it looks like we have about 14 minutes or 13 minutes for questions. Thank you. So yeah, if you could, thank you. Yeah, if you could step up, oh yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask about my favorite recurring planet, Planet Burbank, and ask why in the first place the Insomniac Museum was added to the games, why some didn't get them, and the varying levels of that.
I feel like, is that Mike Stout? I can barely see. Oh, maybe not. Okay, I thought, so Mike Stout, he was one of our designers. I thought I recognized someone over there. It looks just like it's Mike Stout's doppelganger over there, actually. He actually, we had all this cool stuff that we were throwing away that we wanted people to see. And so he actually spent extra time. He was originally helping out in QA on the first game, and then he started to do some design work, and he became this great designer. And so he just, in his spare time, laid out this level, and he mapped out the Burbank floor. And it was always something that we ended up doing kind of like someone would take on this project. We never scheduled it in, because all of our schedules were maxed out. There was no room for them. But in Into the Nexus, we actually did dedicate some time to a museum level, and we gave it all the proper artwork and everything. But that's something that I feel like should be in every Ratchet and Clank game, moving forward, certainly. Are there any other questions? Feel free to step up to the mic. We don't throw anything or bite.
Oh, we got some over here.
Can you enlighten us on the art of stacking boxes that you mentioned?
Sure. So the question is the art of stacking boxes, and how did that work? I would have to go back and reread that doc, but I remember it was in A Crack in Time, that temple level. We had this big open space, and there were giant stacks, 10 crates high by 10 crates deep. Yeah. And there was just multiple versions of them. And we just were getting really tired because there's this weird compulsion to actually clear out all the boxes. And then once we make you do that for 10 minutes in this one room, it starts to get kind of painful. So so in his document, he specified the rhythm, the amount of boxes, and then how to stack them, and also to vary it up in such a way where you could have explosive boxes in some crates that would encourage the wrench throw. You'd typically stack boxes behind enemies that were explosive, so you could knock an enemy into them. We actually had special code where the enemy would magnet kind of to the crates, so that you would typically see them getting thrown through them. So there was lots of little things like that that just made it so much more satisfying.
Yeah. And one thing just to add to that is that the bolts that would pop out of those crates, I thought it was interesting when I joined Insomniac, the audio team told me that they actually based that sound on Vegas slot machines because those were designed to make you feel happy when you would collect the coins. So there's even a little bit of psychology in it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. I got into Ratchet and Clank with the PS3 games, and that was my first introduction to them, and I loved them. And I usually don't 100% games, but I love that game so much because I love that they would just banter during the level and they would banter on the way to a level on the ship. And once I completed the story and I wanted to 100%, they stopped talking completely. And when you would travel in a ship, it's like they were deliberately mad at each other or something. Like there was silence, and it's like I would never hear their voices again.
They spent too long together. They
Yeah.
just need a break.
After a while, cabin fever sets in.
It was so weird. I've never experienced that like feeling of, oh, I'm kind of sad now. 'Cause they're not talking anymore. Is that a complaint that's ever come up?
It's not a complaint, but it's certainly something that we always look into, because it's like in A Crack in Time, I remember vividly that there were 10,000 lines of dialogue that I wrote that made it into the game. And that's not counting what we cut, which was probably another 10,000, to be honest with you. And like, so when we dump these massive amounts of dialogue into the game, there's always somebody who has to go in there and balance them and make sure they don't play too much, too often, they don't trip over each other. So it may have been a cooldown issue, it may have just been like they were afraid that it would start to get too repeaty, something like that. It's like balancing dialogue in a game so that it doesn't trip over anything else that you're doing is a full-time job in and of itself. So something we're always constantly working on.
And just to add to that, when we first implemented like Mr. Zircon, I think we had Clank talking, we'd have like these updates. And at one point, one person was just like, I just want this game to shut up. Because it was just like everything was talking all the time. So we had to actually figure out the right pacing for that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
My question is, with like the newest game and the movie, they made Ratchet's face like rounder and like softer, and I was just kind of wondering if you guys know why, because it didn't like look like Ratchet anymore. Like he still felt like Ratchet, but didn't really. I don't know. It was kind of uncanny.
Yeah, I know what you mean. At first, like the plan when we. Because I was working with the team during the first couple months of the Ratchet movie, and we sent all our assets basically up to them with the idea that the same assets would be used in the movie. But ultimately, when they pulled it into their animation software, it didn't translate very well, so they actually had to rebuild everything. And we had animators and artists who would give as much feedback as they could, not just when it came to the models, but also the way that Ratchet smiles, or the way that Clank lilts his head, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, this is something that goes with the territory. Anytime you have somebody who hasn't been working on that franchise for 15 years, where they do their best to mimic, but sometimes it just doesn't work out the way fans expect.
Yeah, this was interesting on Tools of Destruction. We did a commercial for it. Digital Domain, who's this amazing effects house, animated Ratchet, and we're like, who is that guy? Because his face was off, everything was different. And even though they had super talented animators, we ended up creating like a model sheet where one of our animators did poses of his face so that people could follow it. And it's really hard to get right. Like when people start to know a character really well, you can tell when it's off. Question over here.
Hi. So Ratchet and Clank got me into the games industry. So I was just curious, like, what got you guys into the industry?
Oh, wow.
Wow, that's a great question.
Well, the thing that got me into the game industry, I mean, it's funny, like when I'd always been a gamer ever since I was a kid, and I even remember when I was 12, I wrote a story for Super Mario Brothers, and I sent it into the address on the back of a Nintendo Power magazine, because in my mind, everything was just in one building, and they would just like run it up and use it, whatever. But it didn't really work out like that. But when I came out to LA to start a writing career, I also had a background in computer animation and ended up doing QA and doing light design work over at Insomniac, and then they found out that I wrote, and then that became sort of my big entrance into the industry.
Yeah, I actually started playing games in the early 80s. I was totally into the Atari. I went to the Smoky arcades all the time, played all the games there. And then at a certain point, I kind of stopped playing games. I just really wanted to figure out how to make them. I spent a lot of the time in the 80s messing around with my Commodore 64, trying to figure out how to program. I was like super nerdy. And then I didn't realize I could actually get a job in the early 90s as a game designer or an artist. So fortunately, this opportunity just came up where I could do art. Because back in 1991, artists were actually scared of computers. They just wanted to use paint brushes. They didn't want to touch that stuff. And I was like one of the few people willing to do that. So I ended up getting a job and doing something I really love to do. Thank you. That's a great question. I don't know how we're on time. It's 12:30, but I think we got. What's the fist mean? Does that mean? One more question. Gotcha. Okay. One more question.
All right. One question. How much did you guys share tech with Naughty Dog? Because I remember vaguely that the Jack and Daxter engine was the same one that you guys used for Ratchet and Clank, and when they made a sequel, you would update your tech. And for how long did you guys do that?
So that's a great question. It comes up a lot, and unfortunately, I wasn't a tech guy working on it. I know that we didn't just outright take their engine, they didn't like just outright take ours. There were like lots of components that we tried to share, but it's always hard to kind of integrate that tech, especially back then. So in the very early days, there was definitely some components that were being shared. I just don't know the specifics of that.
Because I remember like the patch rendering, and then the vehicles got added, and Jak and Daxter 2, and some of that went into Ratchet & Clank 3. And...
Yeah, we typically didn't share any like gameplay code. It's more on the rendering side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I think that's it. Oh, wait, uh-oh.
So if anybody has any further questions, the speakers can go to room 2022 or 2024 around the area over there for further questions and Q&A with tables.
Okay, we will be there. It's 2022.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, everybody.